Welcome to another episode of Talking About Records. I am G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small independent record store just north of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you don't already subscribe to my channel on YouTube or follow me on Facebook or Instagram, please do that. I really appreciate it. I've got a really cool topic today, 10 albums that changed the face of rock. So a pretty big topic. I didn't have a lot of criteria going into this one. Really the only thing that I would say I tried to do was avoid the obvious. So when I think about albums in the rock genre and ones that kind of changed the game or defined an era or created a genre, subgenre I should say, I tried to avoid Dark Side of the Moon. I tried to avoid Dylan. I tried to avoid Zeppelin or the Beatles or things that, again, I think are just kind of no-brainers. There's a certain number of artists and specific albums that are very obvious that I wanted to go a little bit deeper than. So not to say that the albums I'm about to show you are undiscovered or anything like that, but they're just, I think, a level or two deeper than what you would expect if you're going to go, the greatest albums of all time, the greatest rock albums of all time. So I've got a little bit of thematic order, so some are tied together, and I think that'll make sense. But just want to dive in. So starting with number one, if I'm thinking about an album that changed the face of rock, one of those came out in 1972, and that is Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones. This is, in my opinion, their opus. I think this record encompasses the best of early Stones into kind of as they got into later 70s again. Came out in 72. It's a double LP. And the reason why I picked this LP versus many other great Stones albums is I think this one had a broader influence. It had a broader set of instrumentation, and I think it really set the stage for a lot of future artists. If I think about more modern day artists like a My Morning Jacket or a Dave Matthews or a Black Keys or a Pearl Jam, like you can see them citing this album. You can see the direct correlation back when you think about certain artists like that. And so to me, even though the Stones put out a number of incredible LPs during the late 60s going to the early 70s, Let It Bleed and Sticky Fingers, which came right before Exile on Main Street, this one to me is the one that I think shows the power of the Stones. They were absolutely free. They recorded this in the south of France. You can look up the documentary and more than one that have been done on this album. It's just a creative peak for the band at a time when they could really go in any direction they want, and they really dug their teeth in a really rootsy kind of homegrown way, I guess you could say. It's the only way I can explain it. If you listen to this record and you listen to the directions they went across both LPs, it just hits me really hard, and I can hear the threads from this album all the way through to modern day rock. And I think to me, that's why I picked it as one of the ones that really is a game changer and really, I think, created a lot of lasting influence to this very day. So the Stones, Exile on Main Street, that's the first one I'm going with on my list. Second up, another album that to me really set the stage, and that is Pronounced by Lynyrd Skynyrd. This is a record that, if you want to talk about Southern rock, really, really established the genre, I think, in a lot of ways. And if you look at bands like the Black Crowes or Widespread Panic or, even a country artist like Chris Stapleton, you can hear a lot of the influence from the earliest Lynyrd Skynyrd records, and especially this one. Again, you could pick any of Skynyrd's early records to point to, but for me, going back to the very beginning, this is just a critical release. You've got key tracks like Tuesday's Gone, Give Me Three Steps, Simple Man, of course, Free Bird. One of the best debut albums of all time, in my opinion, and certainly a game changer, certainly an album that, again, kind of defined an entire genre from the early 70s to current day. And so I think looking at the Stones and looking at an album like this, it really you can draw the connection to a lot of modern day artists, and so I think this one was a game changer. I'm sure that Skinner would have went on to, if they never would have released this one, maybe their second or third album would have came out first, and maybe would have been just important. But to me, I think going back to the original, going back to the beginning, is where the entire Southern rock kind of jam band scene started. You've got bands like the Grateful Dead, and you've got a lot of other influences on that specific scene. But I think as far as the Southern element to it, this one speaks volumes. And I think to this day, there's a lot of artists that have been influenced by this record. So that's Skinner. That's my second choice. We're going to go with a little more modern record now. If I think about more current day Americana, there's a little bit of Southern influence in there, some country, some rock. I'm going to go with Uncle Tupelo's No Depression. This came out in 1990, so we're skipping ahead a bit. And again, this blurs the line, calling it rock, of course. I would call this roots rock or Americana or alternative country, whatever you want to call it. But again, the reason why I'm going with an album like this, as far as changing the face of rock, is if you look at what followed Uncle Tupelo's No Depression, as far as artists are concerned, obviously Wilco, obviously Sunvolt, as those are the bands that came out of the death of Uncle Tupelo, with Jay Farrar and Jeff Tweedy forming those bands. But it runs deep because you had Ryan Adams creating Whiskey Town and his solo records are right around the same time. And then you've got artists like the Avett Brothers or Jason Isbell or even Sturgill Simpson to some extent, I think could be pointed back to this. Not only because they're similar in style, if you A-B'd the records, but more so in the aesthetic and what their music is based in. So I think Uncle Tupelo and No Depression really allowed a specific genre of artist in those kind of subgenres I named to be free and to actually cross over into the mainstream and actually sell some records and make a living, right? So it's not to say that roots rock and Americana and alt country weren't happening before this record, but the fact that Uncle Tupelo put it on the map and then the bands that it spawned, Wilco and Sunvolt, continued that. That's why it's a really important record to me, and that's why I think it's a really important record in regards to rock and roll and influence. So if you're not familiar with Uncle Tupelo or some of those other artists I name in this genre, definitely check it out. I think this is just an incredible record. This is actually a recent reissue of the record. This is on a clear vinyl and was a limited edition of 1,500 copies. I really, really cherish that album. So Uncle Tupelo, No Depression, number 3 on the list. I'm going to totally switch gears. We're going to go a couple years earlier, but a completely different genre and kind of a set of albums we're going to run through. Actually, for the rest of these, there's a pretty tight connection. So this is an obvious one to me. So again, I was trying to avoid the obvious, but in some cases you just can't. If you're going to talk about debut albums and you're going to talk about game changers, there's not really any way to avoid Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. This is an album released in '87. It came at a time when hair metal and kind of the cheesier side of 80s rock, I think, was dominating, and this just squashed it. It came in with an attitude, with a hard edge, with just with a whole aura around it that said, we're different, we're here to stay, and we don't care what you've been doing, we're going to do it our own way. That's what Appetite for Destruction did. And I think if you go on, I mean, you could essentially cite any rock band who's come out since then as an influence. If they're a heavy rock band, if they're a guitar-based, rock band, I think GNR probably has an influence, whether it's the heavier side or the ballad side, all the way through to, I think this really paved the way for Nirvana, honestly, because prior to Appetite taking over the charts in '87, '88, again, music that had more of a rough edge and, an aesthetic that really played into the heavier side of music in the mainstream. It just wasn't accepted. And so I think this is critical in a lot of ways for what came just a few years later in the late 80s and the early 90s with what happened with alternative music. So I don't think it can go understated. This is an original pressing, as you can see, with an alternate cover, the original cover, and the more widely known covers right there, which they had to come in shortly after because of the graphic nature of the original one. So I actually love them both. I think they're both equally as iconic. So if you're not familiar with Appetite for Destruction, please fix that right away. So that's a big one. And again, like I said, I tried to avoid some of the obvious, but it's not always easy. This is another one, and this is not going to display well at all on camera because it's the Black Album by Metallica, so it's all black. This is actually a Walmart pressing, you can tell, which is a really cool. This is one of the Walmart pressings that I thought was cool because it is on this smoky kind of black. I don't know how much you can see of it there, but the Black Album, which followed Appetite for Destruction, came out in 1991, so a couple years later. And let's be honest here, Metallica was already a very established band by the time the Black Album hit. I mean, you had, they started out with Kill 'Em All, and then you had Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All, and then they finally got to the Black Album. The reason why I picked this one versus any of those others, which is a little bit along the lines of the GNR topic, is this is the one that really put them on the map on the mainstream. Sure, they were already selling out concerts. They were a huge touring act. But as far as the pop culture and the mainstream radio and MTV and all that, this is the one that really crossed over big. I think the influence is massive if you look at bands like Slipknot or Korn or Tool or pretty much any of the heavy metal, heavy rock type bands that, again, were influenced by GNR. I think there's a big influence from Metallica and from the Black Album for kids that were a certain of age and who were just picking up a guitar in 1991. This was absolutely unmistakable. It was a must-have, and I think, honestly, it still is. So I think this is one that definitely changed the face of rock. Not to discount anything that Metallica did prior to this, obviously, but again, as far as bringing metal to the mainstream, I think that's why this was the game changer, and that's why it kind of changed the face of rock. I know for me personally, I was, right in that high school, middle school, high school age when this album really blew up, and it just opened my eyes completely. And of course, I had heard some of Metallica before, but nothing like this, nothing. It was all over MTV, all over radio. It was impossible to avoid, and there's a reason for that because it's an absolute classic album. All right, let's talk about influence in regards to not metal, but alternative. This is an album that came out in '90, just prior to that Black Album, that really set the stage for alternative rock. Now, it's Jane's Addiction they had a self-titled EP, and they had Nothing Shocking, and this came out as their second full length in '90, and it marked the birth of Lollapalooza, which is critical. So if you're Perry Farrell and it's 1990 and you're putting this record out and you're creating your own festival, it was inevitable that you're going to influence generations to come with an album this strong. I don't think you can discount Nothing Shocking. I love the record, but Ritual is just one of those where I think about early Smashing Pumpkins, and then going through to like Stone Temple Pilots, and even what the Red Hot Chili Peppers did in the early '90s after this record. I just think it's critical, and you can certainly point to all of the bands coming out of the Pacific Northwest, the Nirvanas of the world, the Soundgardens of all the world, like all of them cite Jane's Addiction. And, not to knock Nothing Shocking, but I think this record was the one that just really put it on the map. And it's when Perry Farrell, came up with the genius idea to take the whole thing on the road. And to this day, because of what Lollapalooza meant back then and because of what it still means now, this is just a game changer for me. And I think it's a game changer for a lot of other artists in the rock genre. So definitely changed the face of rock, and it in a lot of ways kind of created that alternative rock moniker in the mainstream, at least. So Jane's Addiction, Ritual, De Habitual, I cannot recommend it enough. Phenomenal album. All right, so we're going to stick right in that same time period. I just mentioned Soundgarden. So this is an interesting one. Louder Than Love, not Soundgarden's most popular album, not even their most heralded album from critics or fans. It came out in 1989, and the reason why I put this on the list is, I love the music. Don't get me wrong. I think there's some incredible tracks on this, and I think it set the stage in a lot of ways for what Soundgarden was going to do over their next couple records. But the reason why this changed the face of rock is because it was the first record put out on a major label out of Seattle. So in '89, again, this is pre-Nevermind, pre-10, pre-Facelift. Soundgarden had a ton of momentum. They were already touring. They were opening for Guns N' Roses and Faith No More on big stadium tours, and they were lumped in as a metal band, more or less, or alternative metal band. Labels and promoters had no idea where to put them. But the fact that this was the first record put out by a nationally distributed label was a huge chance by A&M to do that. And if that didn't happen, who knows if the labels would have flocked to Seattle as quickly as they did, and as in such an overwhelming fashion. So who knows if Nirvana gets discovered as quickly, if Soundgarden's Louder Than Love didn't kind of put it on the map on a national level from the perspective of getting signed. So that's the key for me here. I love this record. I think Gun, Get on the Snake, Full on Kevin's Mom, Loud Love, Big Dumb Sex. There's so many songs on this that Soundgarden performed throughout their entire career. I was reading up on this, and there was an interesting quote from Kirk Hammett of Metallica, again cross-referencing some of these albums, where he said he actually wrote the riff to Enter Sandman after listening to this record. And I believe it, because there's a lot of influence there. Again, if you take GNR and Soundgarden and Metallica and those bands right in that era, they were all feeding off each other, and they were all changing the face of rock at once. That was a critical period, the late 80s, again, pre-Nevermind, but it was still absolutely necessary for an album like this to get released nationally in order for things to follow it, and they sure did. So Soundgarden's Louder Than Love, highly recommend that. So Soundgarden's Louder Than Love, it certainly would not have existed unless you had this album. Black Sabbath, Masters of Reality, 1971. Again, if I'm going to talk about Metallica or Soundgarden, obviously, and then Metallica, GNR, even Jane's Addiction, like none of those exist without Sabbath. And Sabbath's self-titled record is phenomenal, but to me, this is the one that I see most artists point back to. It's the one I kind of point back to. If I'm going to pick a Sabbath record to introduce to someone, it's going to be this one. Maybe Paranoid, but probably Masters of Reality. Into the Void, I think, is just a phenomenal track. Sweet Leaf, Children of the Grave, just an absolutely epic album in every way, shape, or form. I don't think you can discount it. And again, if I'm gonna talk about the founders of metal and heavy metal, Led Zeppelin's probably in that conversation, of course, but Led Zeppelin had a softer side to them in a lot of ways. Sabbath did a little bit, but if I think about the influence and the game-changing impact in the early 70s of creating a genre, I think Sabbath had a lot to do with all of the heavy metal and all of the rock to follow. Everything I've named here, again, from GNR to Metallica, Jane, Soundgarden, all those associated bands, I think followed suit because of an album like this. It's my favorite Sabbath album, so definitely check it out if you don't know that one well. All right, we're going to switch genres a little bit. That was 71. We're going to move forward a few years to another genre-defining album, the Ramones' self-titled record, 1976. Again, I tried to avoid the obvious, but in some cases you just can't, and this is one of those as well. If you look at what was going on in the mid to late 70s in New York and London, this is an album that just broke through and just kind of tore down all the barriers. It showed kids that you didn't have to have an immense amount of skill to get on stage, make some noise, and have some fun. That's what the Ramones are for me, and I think that's what they were for an entire generation. It inspired the Clash to get on stage and do what they do, and they were an incredibly iconic band that inspired generations as well. But Black Flag, you had the Misfits, all inspired by this, and then fast forward to current day or the last 20 years, and you've got the likes of Green Day and Rancid, and of course even Nirvana and like the Strokes. It's just cannot be said how influential the Ramones were. A lot of people maybe only know a couple hits by the Ramones, but if you dive into their catalog, especially the early stuff, the first few records, which is what I appreciate the most, that's where I think you can really hear the genius in what they were doing. It's 3 chords and the truth, pedal to the metal, plow through it, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what they did. They put it on the map. They created it. They certainly changed the face of rock with this album. Last but not least, another genre-defining album. This is my original press of Rage Against the Machine's self-titled album. So if you were around in 1992, like I was, and you're in, kind of in that high school or college age, this was impossible to avoid. It grabbed your attention like nothing else. A song like Killing in the Name of, or Bomb Track, or Know Your Enemy. Oh my gosh, just so many incredible songs. Again, 1992, nothing, there is no nu metal without this album. There's no rap rock without this album. There were other artists doing it. Yes, I'm not saying Rage was the only one. You can look at artists like A Faith No More and plenty of others who were there as well. But this is the one, again, that I think broke through. I think Lollapalooza helped that. I think MTV helped that. But if you look at Korn and Kid Rock and Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park and all of those types of bands, this is where that all began. I think, again, on a mainstream level, I think this had a significant impact in creating that genre, for good or bad. And Rage as a band, I think the other thing that they did was they focused so heavily on activism, and everything they did, every lyric Zach wrote, and all of the songs they put together, and the presentation of what they did with their albums and with their tours, it was so steeped in a reason. Like, there's nothing they did that was kind of nonchalant. It was all there because they really felt it and they believed in it and they stood behind it. And I think that's something, another thing that a lot of artists took from Rage Against the Machine still to this current day is, if you're going to write a song, you're going to write a record and put it out, like, make it mean something. And so that's why, again, it's another really important record for me personally. I think it's definitely another record that changed the face of rock, because I don't think a lot of what came after this happens unless you have this record in particular. So that's my list. I'd love to hear what you think of it. I'd love to hear the albums that, in your opinion, changed the face of rock. Check these out. Check out the rest of the channel. Give me some more ideas for other videos. I'd love to hear some other topics that you think might be interesting. Again, my name is G.I. Sanders with NTX Vinyl. I really appreciate you listening. This has been another episode of Talking About Records, and we'll see you next time.